r/MaliciousCompliance. Credit stealing coworker demanded I quit, so I did. Hashtag the breaking point. You need to leave. I stared at Derek across the conference table, my coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips. Around us, the open plan office of Tech Venture buzzed with the usual Monday morning chaos, keyboards clacking, Slack notifications dinging, someone microwaving something that smelled suspiciously like fish. But in that moment, the world had narrowed down to just the two of us. I'm sorry, what? I set my cup down carefully, buying myself time to process what I'd just heard. Derek leaned back in his chair with the kind of smug confidence that only comes from someone who genuinely believes they've already won. He was wearing one of those startup uniform outfits, expensive athleisure that screamed I make six figures, and his dark hair was perfectly styled in that deliberately tousled way that probably took him 15 minutes to achieve. He smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. I said you need to leave. Quit. Find another job. This company doesn't need you, and frankly, you're just dead weight at this point. You're holding us back. My hands clenched under the table. This was it. This was the moment that 8 months of accumulated frustration, anger, and disbelief finally reached its breaking point. But let me back up. Because this didn't happen in a vacuum, and Derek didn't just wake up one day deciding to humiliate me in front of, well, okay, nobody was actually watching this particular conversation since it was happening in one of the small conference rooms. But the audacity of it still took my breath away. I'm James Chen, 28 years old, and I've been working at Tech Venture for 3.5 years. I came here fresh out of my computer science degree from Stanford, eager to make my mark in the startup world. Tech Venture is one of those prestigious tech companies that everyone wants to work for. We develop middleware solutions for enterprise software, the kind of boring but essential infrastructure that keeps the digital world running. Our clients are Fortune 500 companies, and our code is genuinely impressive. Or at least, it was when I was writing most of it. Derek joined about 18 months ago. He came from a mid-tier company with an impressive-sounding job title and a resume that looked stellar at first glance. Our manager, Patricia, hired him as a senior developer with the idea that he'd help mentor some of us mid-level developers and bring fresh perspectives to our workflow. I remember thinking it was a good decision. I even offered to help him get up to speed with our codebase during his first few weeks. That was my first mistake. It started small. We'd be in a team meeting, and I'd suggest an architectural solution for a particularly thorny problem we'd been wrestling with for days. I'd lay out the approach, the trade-offs, why I thought it would work. Derek would sit there, quiet, taking notes. Then, a few days later, after I'd implemented the solution, he'd somehow be the one explaining it to Patricia and the rest of the team as if he'd come up with it himself. When I'd try to clarify, he'd smile that same smile and say something like, yeah, we workshopped this together, or I refined James's rough idea into something actually workable. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was overthinking it. After all, collaboration is part of programming, right? Ideas build on each other. It was petty to keep track of who came up with what. Except then it got worse. There was the API optimization I spent 3 weeks perfecting. Derek presented it in a client meeting as his own work. There was the algorithmic approach to database query performance that I coded up in a late-night session. I found Derek walking through it with Patricia the next morning, describing it in detail as if he'd written every line himself. There was the automated testing framework I designed from scratch, which he somehow managed to take credit for during a company all-hands meeting. Each time, I considered saying something. Each time, I bottled it. Why? Because Derek was smart about it. He never outright lied. He'd use language that was just ambiguous enough, we, the team, this approach, that when I tried to push back, it looked like I was being petty or territorial. And more than that, I realized that Derek had been building relationships with the right people. He was always joking with Patricia, always complimenting our VP of engineering, always in the room when decisions were being made. Meanwhile, I was heads down doing the work, not necessarily thinking about optics or visibility. It's one of those frustrating lessons you learn in the corporate world. Sometimes being good at your job isn't enough. Sometimes you need to be good at appearing good at your job, which is an entirely different skill set. By month 6, Derek was being talked about as a potential lead on our next major project. By month 10, there were whispers that he was being groomed for a promotion to principal engineer. I watched this happen with a kind of growing horror, knowing that virtually every innovation and solution being attributed to him had come from my mind, my late nights, my problem solving. I tried talking to my mentor, an older developer named Frank who'd been at Tech Venture since the beginning. I did it carefully, trying not to sound bitter. Look, Frank said, ordering us coffee at the cafe downstairs, Derek's a smooth operator. But here's what you need to understand, eventually, people figure it out. Documentation doesn't lie. Code doesn't lie. The truth comes out. I wanted to believe him. I really did. Instead, Derek got bolder. He started pushing his name on projects I was actively working on. He'd review my code, make minor changes, then mark himself as a co-author. He'd interrupt me in team meetings, contradicting my technical explanations. He was playing a game where he was rewriting the narrative of the company's technical achievements, and I was the ghost writing the story. And then, today, he decided to go for the end game. I'm serious, Derek continued, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. Everyone knows you're not cutting it anymore. Patricia's been asking me to evaluate your performance, and honestly, it's not looking good. The faster you leave voluntarily, the easier we can make it. You can find somewhere else that's better suited to your capabilities. The implication was clear, if you don't quit, I'll get you fired. And I'll do it credibly because everyone already believes you're doing my work. I looked at him for a long moment. Really looked at him. At his confidence. At his conviction that he'd already won. And I made a decision that would change everything. Okay, I said quietly. You're right. I quit. Hashtag the logistics of revenge. The silence that followed my words lasted exactly 3 seconds. Derek's confident smile faltered for just a moment, long enough for me to see that he'd expected pushback, negotiation, tears maybe. He hadn't actually expected me to just agree. Well, he said, recovering quickly, I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. I'll let Patricia know you've decided to pursue other opportunities. You should probably start wrapping up your current assignments. I'm leaving today, I interrupted. Right now, actually. I'm going to go pack up my desk. Derek blinked. Today. That's pretty fast, but sure. I guess that works out fine. We can probably redistribute your workload pretty quickly. I wasn't listening anymore. I stood up, pushed my chair in with probably more force than necessary, and walked out of the conference room. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my hands were shaking slightly as I headed toward my desk in the open office area. The thing about making a dramatic decision in the heat of the moment is that about 30 seconds later, reality starts catching up with you. As I walked through Tech Venture's sleek office, past the beanbag chairs nobody actually sat in, past the innovation wall, covered with inspirational quotes about disruption, past the kitchen where someone had left a passive-aggressive note about the communal fridge, I started doing the math on what I'd just done. Rent, $2,400 a month. I had about 4 months of savings, maybe 5 if I cut back. No health insurance as of end of month. My contract said 2 weeks notice, which meant I'd technically owe them a month's severance unless they waived it, but they could also claim breach and sue me. Not that they would, the PR headache alone, but the threat was there. I sat down at my desk, a standing desk I'd splurged on 2 years ago, and stared at my 3 monitors. One of them displayed the code I'd been working on all morning, an elegant solution to a distributed caching problem that we'd been struggling with for weeks. Beautiful code. The kind of code that would probably end up in Derek's portfolio within days. That was when the cold clarity hit me. Derek had just essentially told me that he was planning to take credit for everything I did and fire me if I didn't cooperate. He'd overplayed his hand because he was so confident that I had no leverage, no way to fight back. He genuinely believed I was powerless. But I had one thing he didn't have, access. Right now, in this moment, while he was still sitting in that conference room probably texting Patricia about what a mature decision I'd made, I still had full access to every system. Every repository. Every document. Every piece of work I'd ever done at this company. I looked around the office. Most people were heads down in their work. The music playing over the speakers was some generic lo-fi hip-hop playlist designed to foster focus and creativity. Nobody was watching me. Nobody was paying attention to James Chen, the deadweight who'd just quit. I pulled up my email on my personal phone and started taking screenshots of the Git commit history for every major project I'd worked on. The timestamps. The comments. The code. Evidence that would be admissible in a conversation with Patricia, at least. Then I opened Slack and scrolled back through months of conversations. There were threads where Derek had literally asked me for help with implementation details, where I'd walked him through solutions, where the evidence of my work was right there in black and white. He'd just been betting that nobody would ever bother to look back far enough to see it. I copied and pasted key conversations into a private document, being very careful to screenshot them rather than forward them, because I knew that forwarding things could be traced in ways that might look malicious. This was just research. For my own records. My phone buzzed. A Slack message from Patricia. Hey James, Derek mentioned you're looking to leave. Can we chat about this? My office in 5. I stared at the message. This was the moment. Right now, I could go to Patricia's office and explain what had been happening. I could present my evidence. I could probably make a case for harassment or credit theft or whatever legal term applied to what Derek had been doing. And then what? Even if Patricia believed me, and she might not, given that Derek had clearly been setting the narrative for months, I'd be the bitter employee going after my coworker on my way out the door. I'd be the one who looked like the problem. Derek had been so careful, so strategic. He'd built enough deniability that my word against his would be genuinely uncertain. No. If I was going to do this, I needed to do it the right way. The way that would actually matter. I pulled up my VPN connection and thought carefully about what I needed to do. What I could do. And what would cross from malicious compliance into something that could actually get me arrested. The line was thinner than I'd realized. My contract explicitly stated that all code I wrote was the property of Tech Venture. That was standard for the industry. But there were provisions for personal use of code written on company time if it was unrelated to company projects. Gray areas. Definitely gray areas. More importantly, there was the matter of documentation. The detailed technical documentation I'd written explaining how various systems worked. The internal wikis I'd created. The code comments I'd written. These were all work product, technically company property, but a lot of it existed in a weird space between my personal notes and official documentation. I could delete things. The thought appeared in my mind, fully formed and terrifying. I could delete entire repositories. I could wipe out my contributions so thoroughly that Derek would have nothing to work with. It would cripple the team. It would probably violate my employment agreement in ways that could result in legal action. But, and here's where the malicious compliance angle became clear, Derek had literally told me to quit. He demanded it. I was simply complying with his explicit request. Anything I did after that point was just managing the transition of my work. I stood up, my hands still shaking slightly, and walked to Patricia's office. I needed to think about this. I needed to make sure I was actually doing this for the right reasons and not just out of spite. The thing about spite, I was learning, was how quickly it could feel justified when you were angry enough. Hashtag the conversation that changed everything. Patricia's office was exactly what you'd expect from a VP at a tech startup trying to appear relatable. There were plants that looked like they'd been watered exactly twice, a standing desk covered in sticky notes, and a framed photo of her at some tech conference shaking hands with someone vaguely famous. The window behind her overlooked the city, and right now the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across her face. Close the door, she said as I entered, which immediately put me on edge. Patricia wasn't usually the door-closing type. She prided herself on having an open office culture, which mostly meant she left her door open while doing her actual work in conference rooms where she couldn't be interrupted. I closed the door and sat down in the chair across from her desk, which was strategically positioned lower than hers. Intentional, I'm sure. So, she began, folding her hands on her desk in a way that screamed corporate training. Derek says you're unhappy with the company and you've decided to resign. That's quite sudden. You didn't mention anything about being dissatisfied in your last one-on-one. That had been 3 weeks ago. I'd spent the entire meeting listening to her talk about quarterly goals and my growth trajectory, which apparently included Derek's projects as my own contributions. It's been building for a while, I said carefully. I think I've just reached a point where I need a change of scenery. Patricia leaned back in her chair. You're a talented developer, James. I'd hate to lose you. Is this about compensation? Because I might be able to work something out there. We've got some budget flexibility for. It's not about money, I lied. It was partly about money. It was partly about a lot of things. Then what is it? She was studying me now, and I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was trying to figure out if this was a negotiation tactic or if I was genuinely leaving. Did something happen? Is it Derek? Because if there's a team dynamics issue, we can address that. No, I said quickly. Too quickly. It's nothing like that. I just think my skills might be better utilized somewhere else. The words felt hollow even as I said them. They sounded like corporate resignation speak, the kind of thing people say when they're legally obligated to give notice but aren't allowed to tell the truth. Patricia was quiet for a moment, and I could see her mentally categorizing me. Difficult employee. Probably going to a competitor. Need to do damage control. Well, she finally said, I'm sorry to hear that. We'll obviously need to handle the transition carefully. What's your timeline? 2 weeks' notice. I was thinking end of day today, I said. Her eyes widened slightly. Today. James, that's not going to work. We have projects that depend on your contributions. You can't just leave today. There it was. The acknowledgement that I actually did contribute something. That my work actually mattered. And Derek had been lying through his teeth. Derek seemed to think it was fine, I said flatly. Patricia's expression shifted. Something flickered across her face, confusion, then something that might have been anger. What exactly did Derek say to you? I had a choice here. I could tell her everything, about the months of credit theft, about Derek's ultimatum, about the fact that he'd explicitly demanded I quit and had been planning to take credit for my work indefinitely. I could lay out the evidence I'd been gathering. I could make this about justice and fairness and company culture. Or I could maintain the upper hand by being vague. He mentioned that he thought my contributions weren't a good fit with the team's direction, I said, which was technically not a lie. He'd implied exactly that. Patricia stood up abruptly and walked over to the window, looking out at the city. When she turned back to face me, her expression had hardened. Okay, she said. Here's what's going to happen. You're not leaving today. You're going to take the rest of the afternoon off, and you're going to come back tomorrow. We're going to have a proper meeting with HR present. And then we're going to discuss what's actually going on here, because I'm not buying this sudden departure story. Patricia, I don't care what you think right now, she interrupted, and I realized that beneath the corporate polish, she was genuinely frustrated. You're not thinking clearly. You're reacting to something, and I'd like to understand what that something is before we make any decisions that you might regret. My hands were clenched so tightly in my lap that my nails were cutting into my palms. She was right, and I hated that she was right. I had been reacting. I'd been making decisions based on anger and spite, and I was only now starting to see the consequences of that. Derek's been taking credit for my work, I blurted out, the words coming out in a rush before I could stop myself. 4 months. In meetings, with upper management, on his portfolio. Entire projects that I built, he's claiming as his own. And he told me that if I didn't quit, he'd get me fired, and that nobody would believe me because everyone already thinks I'm just a deadweight who can't produce anything on my own. The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia stared at me, and I couldn't read her expression at all. Is that true? She finally asked quietly. Every word. She sat back down slowly, like someone who just received news that required sitting for. And you have evidence of this? I have commit histories. Slack conversations where he asked me for help. My documentation. My code comments. He's basically erased his own fingerprints from everything by having me do the actual work and then claiming it. Patricia pulled her keyboard closer and started typing, her jaw clenched. Okay. Don't go anywhere. Sit there. Don't call anyone. Don't message anyone on Slack. I'm going to have a conversation with Derek and I'm going to gather some documentation on my own. She stood up again, and this time her energy was completely different. This was Patricia in VP mode, and I realized I'd just triggered something that I didn't fully understand the consequences of. And James, she said, pausing at the door. Don't quit. We need to talk about what's actually happening here. She left before I could respond, closing the door behind her quietly. I sat alone in her office, staring out the window at the city below, and realized that I'd just made everything exponentially more complicated. I'd come here planning to quietly dismantle Derek's career from the margins, and instead I'd just blown the whistle in a way that would force the company to investigate, which meant scrutiny I hadn't planned for, which meant questions I might not have good answers to. And somewhere out there, Derek was about to find out that his confident assumption of victory had been very, very premature. Hashtag the waiting game. I've never been good at waiting. It's one of those things about myself that I've known since childhood, the kind of personality trait that makes you terrible at surprise parties and terrible at not checking your test scores the moment they're posted. I sit and I fidget and I second-guess every decision that led me to the moment where I'm sitting in an uncomfortable chair waiting for something terrible to happen. Patricia's office suddenly felt like a trap that I'd voluntarily walked into. The silence stretched out in that room like taffy, getting thinner and more fragile with each passing minute. I could hear the muted sounds of the office beyond a closed door, the ambient noise of people doing their jobs, unaware that the ground was about to shift beneath everyone's feet. Someone laughed outside. A chair rolled across the floor. The normal sounds of a normal day that was about to become very abnormal. I checked my phone. 4:47 p.m. Patricia had been gone for 14 minutes. 14 minutes in which Derek was presumably being confronted by a VP who now knew that he'd systematically stolen months of work. 14 minutes in which my carefully constructed plan to silently delete my code and vanish into the ether had exploded into something far messier and less controllable. I should have just quit. That thought kept cycling through my head on a loop. I should have walked out at the end of the day, updated my LinkedIn, and let Derek's incompetence speak for itself. I would have had the moral high ground and none of this exposure. Now I was sitting here waiting to see whether my confession was going to help me or destroy me. My phone buzzed. A Slack message from Derek. Dude, what the fuck did you tell Patricia? I stared at it. The message was the digital equivalent of a scream. I didn't respond. What was I supposed to say? Yeah, I told her everything because I'm tired of watching you take credit for my work. Patricia had explicitly told me not to message anyone, which meant she was probably watching the Slack logs right now, documenting exactly what was happening. Another message came through. Asterisk, this is bullshit. She's demanding I show her my original work on the customer portal redesign. You know I did that, asterisk. The audacity of it was almost impressive. He actually believed his own mythology so thoroughly that he expected me to corroborate his lie. Or maybe he thought I'd panic and try to help him, afraid that my confession would implicate me somehow. I didn't respond. I just set my phone face down on the armrest of the chair and stared at the window. The thing about working in tech is that everything is documented. Every line of code has a timestamp and a name attached to it. Every commit message is preserved in a version control system like a digital fossil record. Every Slack conversation is archived and searchable. Derek had apparently believed that none of that mattered, that confidence and charisma were enough to override the evidence of actual work. That the people in charge cared more about the narrative he told than the truth hiding in the data. I was betting my entire career on the assumption that he was wrong. The stakes of that bet were just now really hitting me. If Patricia investigated and found that I was right, Derek would be fired and I would be, what? A hero? A snitch? A guy who threw his coworker under the bus? The corporate narrative around this would be whatever Patricia decided it was. I'd just given up all control over how my own story was told. There was a knock on the door. I jerked upright, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. It was only 4:59 p.m. That felt too soon. That felt like things had already gone very wrong or very right in some way I wasn't prepared for. Come in, Patricia called from outside, which was odd because she wasn't in the office with me, which meant she must have been checking something in. Oh. Oh no. Derek was standing in the doorway, and his face was the color of someone who just realized that his world was collapsing. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice tight with the kind of anger that comes from panic. She won't even let me explain. She's just pulling up my work history and asking me where the original code is, and I'm telling her that I collaborated with people but she's not accepting that as an answer because apparently, his eyes landed on me, and something shifted in his expression. You. Derek, I said carefully, you need to let Patricia handle this. Let her handle it. You sabotaged me. You went running to the VP because you couldn't handle the fact that I was doing better work than you, and now you're trying to make it seem like I stole your stuff to cover for your own incompetence. It was fascinating, in a detached way, watching someone's lies start to unravel in real time. He was genuinely operating from a place where he believed this narrative. He believed that I was jealous of him. He believed that his appropriation of my work was actually just collaboration that he'd taken the lead on. He believed that everyone would see through my accusations because clearly I was just trying to drag him down. I have commit histories, I said quietly. I have Slack messages where you asked me for help. I have documentation with my name on it. That's not sabotage, Derek. That's just evidence. Evidence of what? That we work together. Great. That's literally what collaboration is. Evidence that you presented my work as your own to upper management and told me I'd be fired if I didn't quit, I said, and there was something almost liberating about saying it out loud for a second time. That's not collaboration. That's theft. Derek's face went through a series of expressions, anger, then confusion, then something that might have been the beginning of understanding that he'd fundamentally miscalculated. She's probably going to fire you anyway, he said, but it sounded like he was trying to convince himself rather than me. For being vindictive and toxic. Maybe, I said. But at least it'll be honest. He left before Patricia returned, which was probably wise. A few minutes later, Patricia's silhouette appeared in the doorway again, and she looked exhausted. All right, she said, sitting back down at her desk. Let's talk about what happens next. Hashtag the reckoning. Patricia looked smaller than she had that morning, which I didn't think was possible for someone who commanded as much authority as she did. She had a folder in front of her, an actual physical folder, which felt anachronistic in a software company where everything was supposed to be digital and cloud-based. I wondered what was in it. Probably printouts of commit histories. Slack logs. Evidence. Before we go any further, she said, I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need you to answer them honestly. Are you prepared to do that? Yes, I said. Did you remove any code from the company systems before coming to talk to me today? My mouth went dry. This was the question I'd been dreading since the moment I decided to confess instead of quietly sabotaging Derek. I deleted nothing, I backed everything up to my personal drives but left the company systems intact, which meant the evidence was still there, which meant Patricia could verify everything I'd said. But she was asking me this like she already suspected I'd done something, which meant Derek had said something, or she'd found something, or... No, I said. Everything I wrote is still in the systems. All the code, all the documentation. It's all there. Patricia nodded slowly, which could have meant anything. She opened the folder and turned it around so I could see what was inside. Commit histories. Line after line of code with timestamps and author names. But there was something else too, a series of messages, printed out in that corporate document format that made everything look more official and damning than it would have on a screen. I had our IT department pull these about 20 minutes ago, she said. Derek's Slack history from the past 6 months. I'm going to read you something. She adjusted her glasses and read, I'll just tell them it was my idea. They won't check the code anyway. Everyone's too busy. The color drained from my face. That was Derek, sending that message to someone named Marcus from the infrastructure team, on March 14th of this year, Patricia said. Would you like to hear the response? Yes. I think so. Marcus wrote back, dude, that's risky. The commit history is right there. And Derek's response was, Patricia doesn't know how to read commit histories. And even if she did, who cares? I'll be gone in 6 months anyway when Google or Meta recruits me. Might as well get all the credit I can before then. The words hung in the air between us. Derek had documented his own theft. He'd literally written out his strategy for stealing credit and banking on his manager's technical incompetence to get away with it. It was the kind of arrogance that only comes from someone who believes they're fundamentally smarter than everyone around them. There are more messages, Patricia said quietly. Quite a few more. But I think you get the picture. I realized I was holding my breath. I let it out slowly. What happens now? I asked. Patricia closed the folder and set it aside. That's complicated. And I'm going to be honest with you because you've been honest with me, and I think you deserve that much at least. She stood up and walked to the window, the same window I'd been staring out of 15 minutes earlier. The sun was lower now, casting longer shadows across the city. Derek is going to be fired, she said. That's not going to change. What he did, systematically stealing credit, documenting his strategy to do so, attempting to intimidate you into quitting, that's a termination-level offense. We have documentation. We have commit histories. We have his own messages. HR is going to have a field day with this, and frankly, I'm already dreading the paperwork. Okay, I said carefully. But here's where it gets complicated for you, Patricia continued, turning back to face me. You knew this was happening. For months, you knew. And instead of coming to me earlier, instead of filing a formal complaint through proper channels, instead of documenting this in a way that would have been easier for the company to handle, you decided to take matters into your own hands. The implication landed hard. You're angry, I said. It wasn't a question. I'm not angry, Patricia said. I'm frustrated. There's a difference. I'm frustrated because the right thing to do would have been to involve me 3 months ago. I'm frustrated because your approach, while I appreciate your honesty today, was confrontational and personal rather than professional. And I'm frustrated because now the company is going to be in a position where we have to consider whether we want to keep an employee who, while a victim of workplace misconduct, also demonstrated questionable judgment in how they handled it. Are you firing me? I asked. I don't know yet, she said, and that honesty was somehow worse than if she just said yes. That's going to depend on a few things. First, I need to talk to HR. Second, I need to understand whether your decision to confront Derek and then immediately come to me was a calculated move or a genuine change of heart. And third, I need to figure out whether keeping you on staff sends the message that this company rewards people who take justice into their own hands, or whether it sends the message that we stand by employees who are being exploited. I didn't come here as a calculated move, I said. I came here because I realized that quietly deleting my code and disappearing was basically admitting that Derek had already won. That all he had to do was be confident enough, and he could take whatever he wanted. Patricia studied me for a long moment. That's a good answer. I'm not sure if it's the true answer, but it's a good one. It is the true answer, I said. Okay, Patricia said. Then here's what's going to happen. You're going to take the rest of the day off. You're going to go home. You're not going to message Derek, you're not going to message anyone in the office, and you're definitely not going to access the company's systems. Is that clear? Clear. Tomorrow, I want you to come in at 9 a.m. and meet with me in HR. We're going to discuss the details of what happened, we're going to go over what your options are, and we're going to determine what happens next with your employment. You might keep your job. You might not. But I can promise you that Derek's status here is finished as of today. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that you were about to fall but not knowing whether there was water or rocks at the bottom. Thank you, I said, because I couldn't think of anything else to say. Don't thank me yet, Patricia said. You might not like what happens next. Hashtag the waiting game. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember the traffic or the weather or even which route I took. My mind was trapped in Patricia's office, replaying the conversation over and over again, analyzing each word for hidden meaning. You might not like what happens next. That was what stuck with me. Not reassurance. Not condemnation. Just honest uncertainty. My apartment felt smaller when I walked in, or maybe I felt larger, bloated with anxiety and adrenaline that had nowhere to go. I sat on my couch and stared at my phone. It was 4:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. The workday was still technically happening. Derek was probably at his desk right now. Or had security already walked him out? Was he in Patricia's office experiencing his own version of this conversation, or was she saving the worst for last? I opened my laptop before I could think better of it. My work email was still accessible, they hadn't locked me out yet. There were no messages. The Slack channel where the team usually coordinated was quiet, which was unusual for this time of day. Normally there'd be a flurry of questions about the day's deploy, updates on the evening's testing, jokes about coffee and Friday being far away. Nothing. I closed the laptop. That was a line I shouldn't cross, and I knew it. Patricia had been explicit about not accessing company systems, and even though she probably meant infrastructure, even though checking email was technically just receiving information that had been sent to me, I could feel the transgression of it anyway. The easy rationalizations were exactly the kind of thing that had gotten Derek into trouble in the first place. My phone buzzed. My heart jumped. It was a text from an unknown number. Hey man, this is Marcus from Infra. Derek just told me he got fired. He said you ratted him out. What the fuck? I stared at the message. How had Marcus got my number? It didn't matter. What mattered was that Derek was telling his story to everyone who would listen, and his story almost certainly wasn't. I systematically stole credit and documented it in messages I forgot could be retrieved. I didn't respond to Marcus. What was I supposed to say? Yes, I exposed someone for theft. He told you he was fired but not why. The image of Derek in the office, probably right now, spinning the narrative, painting me as the villain, made my skin crawl. Another text came through, this one from a number I recognized. It was James, one of the other engineers on the team. Dude, where did you go? Derek's packing his stuff. Patricia's in a mood. What happened? I typed out a response and deleted it. Typed out another and deleted that too. Finally I wrote, long day. Talk tomorrow. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then nothing. I made dinner I didn't eat. I took a shower that lasted too long. I lay in bed at 8 p.m. with my brain still running at full capacity, unable to wind down despite the emotional exhaustion that had hollowed me out from the inside. The thing about waiting is that it gives you too much time to think. Too much time to imagine all the possible outcomes. HR meetings could go anywhere. Companies had policies about internal disputes, about how to handle them, about liability and precedent. I'd been honest with Patricia about my motivations, but honesty wasn't the same as innocence. I'd still considered deleting the code. I'd still confronted Derek in a way that was designed to humiliate him. I'd still taken matters into my own hands instead of following proper channels. What if they decided I was a liability? What if they worried that keeping me on staff would create a hostile work environment now that Derek was gone? What if they were already worried about a lawsuit, either Derek suing for wrongful termination, or the company covering itself by preemptively removing anyone involved in a situation? I'd been at this startup for 5 years. 5 years of good performance reviews, successful projects, relationships built with colleagues. But Derek had been here for 2 years and was apparently confident enough in his recruitment prospects that he'd assumed he could leave whenever he wanted. If he could be fired, so could I. Job security in tech was a myth we all pretended to believe in until it wasn't. At 11 p.m. I got up and opened my laptop again. This time I didn't check email. Instead, I pulled up my resume. It was 6 months out of date. I updated it, added recent projects, carefully, only the ones I could definitely claim full credit for, updated my skills section, fixed some awkward phrasing. If I was going to be fired tomorrow, I needed to be ready. But as I was reviewing it, another thought came to me: if I was fired, it was going to look bad. In tech, people gossip. Derek would tell his version of events to anyone who would listen. Maybe he'd sue. Maybe he'd claim I was the one who'd stolen his ideas. He had more to lose than I did. His professional reputation was already damaged by his own messages, but people didn't always think rationally when they were desperate. I could see it now: job search, background checks, potential employers calling my references and getting a story about internal dispute or workplace conflict. The details might come out, but they might not. And even if they did, the mere fact of the conflict would stick. No company wants to hire someone who's been involved in workplace drama. I closed the laptop and lay back down, but sleep was further away than ever. The next morning came too soon. I woke up at 6 a.m., my body tight with tension, and couldn't fall back asleep. I showered, dressed in the same outfit I'd worn the day before because it felt like armor. Business casual. Professional. Not defensive, but prepared. I arrived at the office at 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes early. The parking lot was normal. People were coming in with their coffee. No one was talking about Derek. Maybe he'd already been escorted out by security. Maybe there was a confidentiality agreement. Maybe everyone was just waiting to see what happened next, same as me. Patricia's office door was already open. She was sitting at her desk. An HR representative I'd never seen before was standing by the window. When Patricia saw me, she didn't smile, but she did gesture for me to come in. "Let's talk about your future here," she said, "and what that's going to look like. #the reckoning." I stepped into Patricia's office and closed the door behind me. The HR representative extended her hand. "Jennifer something." I caught her name, but my brain wasn't retaining details anymore. Everything felt slightly muffled, like I was experiencing this through water. "Sit down," Patricia said, not unkindly. I sat. Jennifer remained standing, which somehow made this feel more official. More dangerous. "Before we begin," Patricia said, "I want to be clear about something. What happened with Derek, that's contained. It's being handled as a personnel matter, and there will be appropriate confidentiality agreements signed by everyone involved. That includes you." "Okay," I said carefully. "That said," Jennifer interjected, "we need to discuss the methods you used to gather evidence. Specifically, the recovery of those Slack messages and emails." My stomach dropped. I didn't hack anything. They were messages sent to me. They're in my history. "We understand that," Jennifer said, and her tone suggested she'd had this conversation before. "Many times. The recovery tools you used to restore deleted messages, those are a bit more of a gray area. I hadn't thought of it as hacking. I'd used a standard data recovery approach that any engineer would know about. But I also knew that just because something was technically possible and technically in my skill set didn't mean it was approved by the company's security policies. "I was gathering evidence of theft," I said. "He was stealing my work." "Which we verified," Patricia said. "And which we've addressed with Derek's termination. But the process matters here. If Derek decides to challenge his termination, one of the first things his lawyer will look at is whether the evidence against him was obtained properly." "I didn't do anything illegal," I said, and then added, quieter, "I don't think." "Probably not," Jennifer agreed. "But companies have policies for a reason. And right now, those policies exist to protect the company first and the employees second. If there's any ambiguity about how evidence was obtained, it creates liability for us." Patricia leaned back in her chair. She looked tired. "Here's where we are. Derek is gone. That part is done. The question now is what happens with you. Am I being fired?" I asked point blank. "Not yet," Jennifer said, which wasn't reassuring. "We want to keep you," Patricia said. "Your work is good. Your performance reviews are solid. But we need to manage this situation carefully." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means," Jennifer said, "that you're going to be placed on a 30-day review period. During that time, we'll be monitoring your behavior, your interactions with colleagues, your use of company systems. At the end of 30 days, we'll reassess." "So I'm on probation. For reporting a crime." "For the methods you used to report it," Patricia corrected gently. "And for your own protection as much as anything else. If Derek does decide to pursue legal action, we want to be able to show that you were cooperative, that you followed company policy after the initial incident, that you didn't continue investigating on your own." It was smart management, I realized. Airtight. They were protecting themselves while appearing to protect me. What about the rest of the team? I asked. Do they know? Derek's departure will be listed as a voluntary resignation, Jennifer said. It's part of his severance agreement. He gets a modest package, we get him to sign confidentiality and non-disparagement clauses, and everyone moves forward quietly. But he didn't resign, I said. He was fired. Technically, Jennifer said with the kind of precision that made me understand why she worked in HR, he was given the choice between immediate termination for cause with a contested severance, or voluntary resignation with a clean reference. He's choosing the latter. So Derek was walking away with a paycheck. Derek, who had stolen my work for months. Derek, who had demanded I quit. Derek was getting money for leaving. That seems, I started, but Patricia cut me off gently. It's the way these things work, she said. It's cheaper than litigation, which is what we'd be facing if we fought this. It protects Derek, it protects us, and in the long run, it protects you too. How does it protect me? I asked. Because now there's no angry former employee with a grudge spreading stories about you to every recruiter in the valley, Patricia said. There's just a guy who quit. That's the story. I understood the logic, but understanding it and accepting it were different things. What about my projects? I asked. The things I was working on. You'll continue your current assignments, Patricia said. James is going to take over the infrastructure work Derek was claiming. We're redistributing the rest. So he gets credit for the work he did steal, and I get to watch other people take credit for the work I do moving forward. No, Patricia said. You're going to document everything going forward. Every commit message, every design decision, every solution you implement. That documentation becomes part of your official record with the company. If there's ever a question about attribution, there's a clear trail. It was better than nothing. But it felt like closing the barn door after the horse had already run off. There's one more thing, Jennifer said. She pulled a folder from her bag and slid it across the desk to me. This is your confidentiality agreement. You're not to discuss the specifics of Derek's departure with anyone. Not colleagues, not friends, not on the internet. You can say he left the company if asked directly, but you cannot discuss the reasons why, the terms of his severance, or any of the circumstances surrounding it. I opened the folder and scanned the legal language. It was dense and comprehensive. It basically covered everything that had happened. If I don't sign this? I asked. Then Derek's severance package is void, which means his legal team gets involved, which means discovery, which means this entire situation becomes much more complicated for everyone, Jennifer said pleasantly. Including you. So I'm being punished for doing the right thing. You're being protected from the consequences of doing it in an unorthodox way, Patricia said. There's a difference. I wanted to argue with her. I wanted to say that this was unfair, that Derek should face real consequences, that the system was rewarding him for theft with a severance package while I got probation and a gag order. But I also needed this job. I had rent to pay. I had student loans. I had a car note. And I had already spent my moral capital for this month. How long is the probation? I asked. 30 days, Patricia said. Then we reassess. If everything looks good, you'll be taken off review. Your record will reflect that you were evaluated, but not that you were on probation. And if everything doesn't look good? Patricia and Jennifer exchanged a look. Then we have another conversation, Patricia said. I signed the agreement without reading all of it. I couldn't afford not to. Hashtag 6 months later. The probation period ended with a quiet email from Patricia saying my status had been returned to standard employee. No fanfare, no apology, no acknowledgement of the absurdity of the last month. I'd spent 30 days documenting everything, aware that every keystroke was being monitored, every Slack message scrutinized for signs of instability or vindictiveness. It was exhausting. It was also clarifying. Somewhere around day 20, I realized I didn't actually want to stay. It wasn't a dramatic realization. There was no moment where I stood up and declared my independence. It was more like waking up one morning and realizing I'd stopped being angry. The anger had calcified into something colder and more useful, clarity. Derek's departure had created a vacuum, and I'd watched how quickly the company had moved to fill it, not by promoting me or acknowledging my contributions, but by shuffling projects around and moving on. I was valuable, sure. But I was also replaceable. And the company had made it clear that loyalty, or at least the appearance of it, was more important than justice. I started putting out feelers. My reputation in the industry was fine. Better than fine, actually. The work I'd done at this startup was real, documented in my GitHub, referenced in blog posts about innovative architecture solutions. When I started taking calls with recruiters, I realized that my actual work spoke for itself. The people I'd helped, the engineers I'd mentored, the open source contributions I'd made, that was my real resume. Derek's theft had tainted the experience of working here, but it hadn't tainted what I'd actually built. 3 months in, I had an offer from another startup. Better pay, better title, and most importantly, a smaller team with actual transparency. The CTO called me before I signed the offer letter. I know what happened at your current place, she said. One of my engineers knows someone who knows someone. I wanted you to hear it from me that we know, and we don't care about the drama. We care about the fact that you're the person who architected that solution everyone's been talking about. The one Derek, she paused meaningfully, apparently forgot to mention you designed. I felt something release in my chest. I'm taking the job, I said. I gave my notice on a Thursday morning in Patricia's office. She seemed unsurprised, which told me she'd been expecting it. Where are you going? She asked. Meridian Systems, I said. They're building a distributed database solution. That's a good company, Patricia said. She didn't try to counteroffer. I appreciated that. I'm sorry this didn't work out better for you. You did what you could, I said, and I meant it. She had, given the constraints of her position. It wasn't her fault that the system was built to protect companies and their bottom lines rather than employees and their integrity. I learned a lot here. I'm sure you did, she said. For what it's worth, I think you made the right call about Derek. And the right call leaving. You're going to do well. 2 weeks later, on my last day, I walked through the office and realized I didn't feel the vindication I'd expected to feel. Derek was already gone, his desk cleared out, his name removed from the access lists. I'd never actually seen him face the full consequences of his actions. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no moment where he was exposed in front of the entire team, no public reckoning. He just left. With a severance package. With a story about a better opportunity that his network probably believed because people like Derek were always chasing better opportunities. The only thing I could point to as evidence of my victory was his absence. But here's the thing about working in tech, the absence echoes. 6 months after I started at Meridian, I got a message from James, the engineer who'd taken over Derek's projects. "Hey man, wanted to reach out," his message said. I never got the full story of what went down with Derek before I got moved to that team, but I've been cleaning up code he left behind and I'm realizing, a lot of this looks like your architecture. Like, the foundational structure, the design patterns, everything. I recognized it from some open source stuff you've done. Just wanted you to know that I know. And everyone here knows now too. It's documented in my cleanup notes. I stared at that message for a long time. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't justice. It wasn't vindication. It was just, the truth, finding its way out anyway. Not because I'd forced it, but because the work itself was the evidence. You can steal credit, but you can't steal competence. You can't fake understanding. Eventually, someone will look at the code and see the author in every line. I replied, "Thanks for letting me know. Good luck with the cleanup." And I meant it. The best part about my new job wasn't the money or the title. It was that I got to build something without looking over my shoulder. I got to push code without wondering if someone was going to claim it in the next meeting. I got to mentor junior engineers with the confidence that they would credit me, not because of a company policy, but because it was the right thing to do. Derek, as far as I know, never worked in tech again. Or if he did, he never got anywhere significant. His LinkedIn profile went dormant. His GitHub had nothing new. He was just a guy who tried to climb by stepping on others and had fallen when his foundation crumbled. I don't know if that qualifies as justice. I know it qualifies as consequence. What I know for certain is this, I don't think about him anymore. He's not the villain of my story. He's just the catalyst. The real lesson wasn't about Derek's betrayal or the company's self-protection or even the validation of being right all along. The real lesson was that my work was always going to be evidence of who I was. And no amount of credit stealing could change that.